The night Daniel came home 4 days early, he understood something he had spent 2 years refusing to name, that the life he had been carefully maintaining was not the same as a life he had been actually living. Daniel Mercer was 38. He restored antique furniture for a living, working out of a rented garage 2 blocks from the house he shared with one other person. He was the kind of man who knew how to be quiet in the right way, how to hold a piece of warped walnut up to the light and find the grain underneath the damage. He was not bitter. He was not particularly sad. He was something quieter than both of those things, and he had lived inside that quiet for long enough that he had stopped noticing it. He had been in Portland for a week consulting on a salvage job for an estate sale company that had acquired 300 pieces of Victorian-era case furniture from a demolished hotel. The job was supposed to run 10 days. On day 6, the estate company's funding froze in a legal dispute and the project was postponed indefinitely. Daniel packed his tools into the back of his truck, called nobody, and drove the 412 miles home in a steady rain that followed him the entire way. He and Nora Ashby had been roommates for 2 years, 4 months, and approximately 12 days, though Daniel had not counted. Nora was 34 and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm downtown. She was precise in the way that her profession demanded, but loose in every other way, the kind of woman who left her coffee mug in exactly 3 rotating locations and could not be bothered to care about it. She had a dry laugh that arrived a half second after the moment it was earned, like she was checking it for accuracy first. They had found each other through a mutual acquaintance, split the utilities cleanly, and settled into the kind of domestic rhythm that required very little conversation and therefore had very little friction. Daniel told himself this was ideal. He was not lying exactly, he was just editing. He pulled into the driveway at 11:40 on a Tuesday. He had not texted ahead. The trip had dissolved fast enough that messaging felt like more ceremony than it warranted. He grabbed his duffel from the passenger seat, left the tool chest for morning, and used his key on the front door. The kitchen light was on. That was normal. Nora kept it on when she was awake late, which she often was. What was not normal was the second coffee mug on the counter, the sound of a conversation stopping 1 beat before Daniel registered that he had heard it, and Nora standing at the island with her arms crossed loosely and her expression cycling through 3 things at once in a way he had never seen on her face before. Standing near the back hallway was a man Daniel did not know, late 30s, blazer over a t-shirt, hair that had been styled at some point earlier in the evening. He was not touching Nora. He was simply there, in the kitchen, at 11:40 at night, and the room had the particular atmospheric weight of a conversation that had been something else a moment ago. Nora said his name. Then she said, "This isn't what it looks like." Daniel set his duffel down on the tile. He looked at the 2 mugs. He looked at the man. He looked back at Nora, whose jaw had a tightness to it that he recognized as the opposite of guilt. It was the tightness of something being misread and not yet corrected. "Okay," Daniel said. The man introduced himself as Garrett. He said it in the way that people say their name when they are hoping it will carry more contextual information than it actually does. Daniel nodded. Garrett said he had been just leaving and then he left, and the sound of the front door closing was precise and polite in the way that exits made by considerate strangers always are. The kitchen was very quiet. Nora uncrossed her arms and picked up her mug and held it with both hands, which was something Daniel had noticed she did when she was working something out. "He's an old colleague," she said. "We were catching up. He's going through a rough divorce, and I am apparently someone he can talk to without it being weird." "That's not weird," Daniel said. "I know it's not weird." She set the mug down. "The face you made when you walked in suggested you thought it might be." "I didn't make a face." "Daniel." She looked at him with the patience of a woman who had watched him sand the same patch of a chair for 40 minutes without speaking. "You absolutely made a face." He conceded the face. He got a glass of water. He stood at the counter and she sat at the island, and there was a stretch of quiet that had a different texture than their usual quiet. Their usual quiet was the absence of necessary conversation. This quiet was something with weight to it, something that had been there, Daniel was beginning to understand, for considerably longer than tonight. "How was Portland?" she asked. "Rained the whole way home." He finished the water. "Job fell through. Legal thing." "I'm sorry." "It's fine." He set the glass in the sink. "I'm going to bed." He did not go to bed. He went to his room and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and thought about a face he had apparently made without deciding to make it, and what that face had meant, and whether the fact that he could not immediately dismiss it said something he had been carefully avoiding for 2 years. In the morning, Nora made coffee. She made 2 cups without asking, which was not unusual, except that when she slid the second one across the island to him, she looked directly at him for a beat longer than the action required. "You want to know something funny?" she said. Not a question. "Sure. Garrett asked me last night if we were together." She wrapped her hand around her mug. "I said no. He asked if we were ever going to be. I told him that was a more complicated question." Daniel did not say anything. The coffee was too hot, and he held it anyway. "I told him that because it was true," Nora said, "not because I was being kind." The rain from the night before had left everything outside the kitchen window dark and gleaming, the neighbor's fig tree dripping steadily onto the fence line. A lawnmower started somewhere 2 or 3 houses down and then thought better of it. Daniel put his mug on the counter. "Complicated how?" he said. She looked at him the way she looked at load-bearing problems, like she was identifying where the pressure actually lived before she touched anything. "Complicated in the way where I've thought about it, and then decided not to think about it because thinking about it while living with someone is not a simple exercise." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They stood across from each other in the morning light with the coffee getting cooler between them and the fig tree dripping and the lawnmower reconsidering, and neither of them said the next thing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. His phone buzzed against the counter. He glanced at it, and it was the estate company's lawyer with a revised timeline and a new contract number. He declined the call. "Portland's postponed another 3 weeks," he said. "So you're here." "I'm here." She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her mug and walked toward the hallway. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. "I have a site visit at 2, but I'm home by 6, if you wanted to do something with that information." She disappeared down the hall. Daniel stood in the kitchen for a moment. He looked at the 2 mugs on the counter. He looked at the spot where Garrett had been standing. He looked at the fig tree which was still dripping. Then he went to his garage and worked on a side table that had been waiting for its second round of staining, and he thought about very little except the grain, and found that for the first time in quite a while, the quiet he was sitting inside had a different quality than the one he was used to. It was the quiet of something already decided, waiting to be said. Nora came home at 6:14. She was still in her work clothes, a dark blazer over a gray shirt, her hair pulled up in the practical way she wore it when she had been on a job site. She had a paper bag from the diner 3 blocks over. She set it on the counter and pulled out 2 containers without making it into anything and said, "I got the soup, the one with the dumplings." "You remembered," he said. "You've ordered it 11 times since we moved in." She set a paper napkin beside his container. "I noticed." The kitchen smelled like broth and pepper and the distant cedar from the open garage. They sat at the island and ate, and Nora told him about the site visit, a retaining wall that was arguing with the slope behind it, and Daniel told her about the side table, about finding a crack in the secondary plinth that had been filled with the wrong compound decades ago and would have to be cleared and reset. The conversation had the ease of 200 previous conversations, except that underneath it, both of them knew tonight was not the same as the other 200 nights, and neither of them pretended otherwise. When the containers were cleared, Nora folded her napkin and looked at the counter. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "After tonight I feel like I should be nervous," Daniel said. She looked up. There was the half-second delay before the smile arrived. "You probably should." She held his gaze. "Were you relieved last night, when you saw Garrett and figured out what it was?" He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I was relieved it wasn't what I thought it was," he said. "And then I was annoyed at myself for caring what it was." "Why annoyed?" "Because caring what it was meant something I hadn't decided to mean yet." She was quiet. She turned her mug on the counter a quarter revolution, then back. "I've been careful with this," she said. "I want you to know that. I didn't decide not to say anything because I was being cowardly. I decided not to say anything because you were here and it was good and I didn't want to break it." "It's not broken," he said. "No," she said quietly. "But it's different now." "Yeah." He reached across the counter and picked up her mug and set it back in the exact same spot she had moved it from, just to give his hand something honest to do. "It's different." She looked at his hand. She looked at the mug. She looked at him with an expression he could not have fully described but would have been able to identify in any light in any room for the rest of his life. Then she said, "I'm not made of glass, Daniel. You're allowed to be less careful." He looked at her for a moment, then he came around the island. He did not move fast. He moved the way he moved toward anything he intended to take care of. She stayed where she was and watched him come. When he was close enough that the kitchen lamp threw its warm amber across both their faces, she tilted her chin up slightly, and he brought one hand up to the side of her jaw, and she closed her eyes for half a second before opening them again and finding him still there. And then the distance between them was not a distance anymore. He kissed her with the kind of deliberateness that 2 years of being careful earns you. She kissed him back with the kind of certainty that tells a person they did not misread the situation. When they separated, the kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been, except that it was not, and neither of them felt the need to say anything about it. What she said eventually was, "For the record, I've been thinking about doing that since you helped me move the couch in without being asked." "That was the first week," he said. "I know when it was." 3 days later, Garrett texted Nora to say that he and his wife were trying mediation, and he thought it might actually work. Nora replied that she hoped it did and meant it, and set her phone down on the coffee table where Daniel was reading the salvage company's revised contract on his laptop. He looked up. "Garrett," she said, "working things out." "Good," he said. And then, without making it into anything, he put his hand on the back of her chair, and she leaned back against it slightly, and they stayed that way until the lamp in the corner needed to be turned on against the evening coming in. It was not a dramatic love. It had not announced itself with urgency or spectacle. It had grown in the only place love actually grows in, which is in the ordinary space between two people who have paid close enough attention to each other that one night it becomes impossible to pretend they haven't. Daniel had learned, by that point in his life, that the things most worth having rarely made noise when they arrived. They simply became part of the room. And then you could not imagine the room without them. The Portland job rescheduled for the following month. He went. He came back. She was in the kitchen with the light on when he walked in the door, and she handed him the second mug before he set his bag down, and he thought about a face he had made on a rainy Tuesday in November, and was grateful that he had made it. 6 months after that, they stopped splitting the utilities differently and started splitting them the same. 8 months after that, he refinished a small walnut box he had salvaged from the estate sale job, the one that had been waiting on his workbench for the right use, and he put a ring inside it that had belonged to his grandmother, and he walked it into the kitchen on a Sunday morning when Nora was making coffee in her socks with her hair loose, and he set the box on the counter and said, "This is walnut, circa 1930. I thought it should go somewhere it matters." She looked at the box. She looked at him. She picked it up with both hands, the way she held things she was trying to understand, and opened it. She was quiet for long enough that he would have been nervous if he had not known her well enough by then to know that her quiet was the space she gave to things that were worth getting right. "Yes," she said, "just that." And then she laughed, the laugh that arrived a half-second late because she was checking it for accuracy, and it was accurate, and the coffee was getting cold on the counter, and neither of them cared even slightly. If you came home early from somewhere and walked into a room you thought you understood and it turned out you had been wrong about what you were seeing, what would you have done? And have you ever had someone in your life right in front of you for years that you almost talked yourself out of noticing? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.